Having the oldest thing is a pretty popular claim for people to make. It grabs attention, and if you're running a business, might encourage more people to visit and maybe even spend some money. Now, one of the most prestigious titles would have to be the oldest building in Melbourne. There are many different places that claim this, but surely they can't all be right. So in today's video, we're going to try and answer this question once and for all. What is Melbourne's oldest building? There are a couple of different ways to frame this question. If we start with the most literal one, then we have a pretty clear winner. Built in 1755, Cook's Cottage in Fitzroy Gardens, just east of the CBD, definitely takes out first place. Contrary to popular belief, this is not actually Captain Cook's cottage, but instead that of his parents from the town of Great Ayton in England. There is a lot of debate as to whether or not he spent any time here at all. The best anyone's been able to come up with is that he probably stayed here while visiting them. Although it is undoubtedly the oldest remaining building in Melbourne at 268 years old, a cottage built in rural England taking out first place probably isn't in the spirit of this question. So let's go investigating a bit more. The second way to frame this question is to restrict it to things actually built here. We don't know what the very first building constructed in Melbourne was, but John Batman's house would be a pretty good contender. He was one of the founders of Melbourne, and settled with his wife Elizabeth and 7 daughters at the base of what became known as Batman's Hill, today the western end of Collins Street, with the first permanent structure built in 1836. It's also possible that some kind of storage hut or supply building would have predated this, but given the flimsy nature of early Melbourne, whether or not these could reasonably be called buildings is questionable at best. In any case, none of them survive today, so would also not help us answer this question. So let's try a third time, and further narrow this down to the oldest buildings constructed in Melbourne that are still standing. This is where the many contenders for the title come in. Probably the best known claimant is this tiny double-storey Russell's Corner store on the southeast corner of La Trobe and King Street in the CBD. Built in either 1850 or 1851, it was built just before the start of the Victorian Gold Rush, which transformed the city and the state forever. It's been used as a house and has also hosted various shops throughout its life, most recently as tea rooms operated by Lola Russell and her husband George. Since these closed in 2017, it's been sold but remains heritage protected. However, despite it often being called Melbourne's oldest building, this is not actually the case. 2 churches, St Francis and St James, both beat out the corner shop. St Francis was built in 1841 on the corner of Lonsdale and Elizabeth Streets and remains there today, while St James was built even earlier in 1839 on the corner of William Street and Little Collins Street. However, in 1914 it was dismantled and moved to its current site on King Street at Batman Street near Flagstaff Gardens. You can still see signs of St James' original location today, such as the name of St James Place. And now you can also have a look inside at its beautiful interior and interesting history exhibit in its new position on King Street. But there is one that is even older, and the one that I think deserves the title of the oldest building in Melbourne. Hidden in this lane between Collins and Little Collins Streets, the Mitre Tavern was first built in 1837 as a private house, before being converted to a hotel in 1868. Since then it's been through a lot of change as it slowly becomes surrounded by taller buildings, and was nearly demolished in the 1930s. But thankfully it was saved, and today it still stands here just as popular as ever. The Mitre 10 hardware chain is apparently named after this very building. It's claimed that 2 of its founders came up with their business idea while having a drink at the bar, according to several historians and the Mitre Tavern itself. But this is disputed by the Mitre 10 business, who say that the name comes from carpentry terminology. We may never know for sure, so take from these stories what you will. So there you have it. The oldest building left in Melbourne is this one right behind me, the Mitre Tavern at 5 Bank Place in Melbourne. There's lots of other things to do in this cool little laneway. There's lots of pubs and cafes and other things to see and do, so it's definitely worth paying a visit if you're ever in the area. There may well have been older buildings around until quite recently, until they either fell victim to dereliction and neglect, or more likely the infamous bulldozers of Well and the Wrecker. Nevertheless, some like this one still stand to remind us of a bygone era. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this and would like to see more, please subscribe to the channel so that you can stay up to date on future videos. Also feel free to visit my website at philipmallis.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.